50 years ago today, on October 6th, 1974, the original Space Battleship Yamato premiered on Japanese television. This epic, 365-day journey from Earth to Iscandar aboard the titular spaceship, an infamous World War II naval vessel retrofitted as a last-ditch effort against an invasive force known as the Gamillas, or Garmillas, or Garmillans, almost ended up DOA like its IRL inspiration. The series was wrought with difficulties, but the indomitable Yamato, unlike its World War II inspiration, eventually rose to prominence, becoming a touchstone moment in the history of anime and pop culture in general. This is the story of how a future anime legend would come to course correct one of Japan's first international mega hits with audiences of all ages, after almost getting wiped from existence by a little girl. The premise was originally thought up by Yoshinobu Nishizaki, who had by that point gotten himself a bit of a bad reputation as an embezzling producer after having worked for the god of manga Osamu Tezuka. Somehow, perhaps with the stolen funds, Nishizaki amassed enough connections and resources to produce his own show. Yoshinobu Nishizaki had grown up under a pre-World War II imperial regime that sought to groom its youth into hyper-nationalistic citizens as it was rapidly industrializing. The eager producer was fully indoctrinated and wanted to produce more of the same for a post-WW2 youth. His efforts, though, were mired by a production hell. The source of these difficulties was eventually identified by the lack of an established mangaka to aid as a visionary source. Space Battleship Yamato was a bit of an anomaly at the time due to its actual source, an anime producer. Nishizaki claims to have gotten the idea for an epic story set in space after reading Methuselah's Children, written by Robert A. Heinlein. Though the producer had technically been initiated into the anime production process, he had come to the medium via supervisory means. This lack of hands-on experience manifested as the project persisted. Regardless, the tradition of producer-driven anime would grow and flourish in Japan, enabling future legends like Yoshiyuki Tomino, Mobile Suit Gundam, and the founders of Studio Trigger, Hiroyuki Imaishi and Masahiko Atsuka. One might even assign the person who would eventually help to salvage Yamato as the instructor of this new generation of anime creators. Leiji Matsumoto had been a published mangaka since the tender age of 16. Manga Shonen honored his young work, Honeybee's Adventure, as a manga contest winner. While this work was admittedly naive, it had an extreme promise, catching the eye of Osamu Tezuka, who would go on to give Matsumoto his earliest professional work. From this point, Matsumoto moved to Tokyo at 18 and soon found work illustrating shoujo, or girls manga. It was at this point he moved into an apartment complex. He specifically chose not to move into the legendary Tokiwa So, which housed many manga greats like Tezuka and their shared friend Shitaro Ishinomori. He did this in order to differentiate himself. And while living at a boarding house in Tokyo's Hongo district, an experience later and loosely depicted in Leiji Matsumoto's breakout manga Otoko Oiden as a degenerate bachelor pad full of dirty underwear fertilizing literal mushrooms, an older neighbor befriended the up-and-coming mangaka. It's likely this bond was aided by Matsumoto's pre-existing bond with his own father, who, like the neighbor, was a World War II veteran under the Japanese military. Matsumoto's father had flown over the actual Yamato, a giant naval vessel whose sinking helped mark the end of Japan's involvement in the war, while his neighbor served as first mate on the Musashi, another battleship that escorted the Yamato to its final resting place. Through this relationship, Matsumoto was handed design documents for both battleships, which would have definitely been confidential during the war. The budding mangaka's star-crossed tale seemed to manifest in its very own life. Nishizaki had been enamored by Matsumoto's Sexoroid, an erotic spy thriller inspired by works like Barbarella. It's also fairly notable that Matsumoto had written about a spaceship Yamato in one of his previous manga, Lightning Ozma. Another mangaka had reconstructed stories about the sunken warship with flight even prior to this. Accounts differ slightly, but it would seem that Adventure King, a manga publication, came to Matsumoto with the Space Battleship Yamato premise and asked him to create its accompanying manga. Interestingly, the manga did debut ahead of the anime series, in spite of the anime being developed first and foremost. It's possible that at this time, Nishizaki also offered him a supervisory role on the anime, but was turned down due to a lack of creative control in the position. Unfortunately, and also fortunately, Eiichi Yamamoto, a legendary anime director who had by this point worked on everything from Astro Boy to Belladonna of Sadness, dropped from the Yamato staff. The eager anime producer would have to yield some of the vision for the series to a burgeoning mangaka looking to make a major splash in the worlds of both animation and sci-fi. It should be noted that the production was not without other major talents prior to Matsumoto's onboarding. Studio Nue would gain renown for their innovative animation work on the series, highlighting newfound realism in space travel, technology, and even altered states of physical reality. The studio would go on to craft the legendary Macross series, which many would call a love letter to the original Space Battleship Yamato. Notable individuals on the staff include Noboru Ishiguro, who had done key animation for Astro Boy and would go on to direct Super Dimensional Fortress Macross, and Yoshikazu Yasuhiko, who would go on to create the aesthetic for Mobile Suit Gundam, which also has some Yamato references that don't paint it in such a favorable light, but that's a different video for maybe even a different channel. Leiji Matsumoto's story treatment for Yamato was an imaginary explosion, filled with references to stories he had written over the last several decades that completely redressed Yoshinobu Nishizaki's original vision. The mangaka had gotten his start in shoujo, but his earliest passions were undoubtedly with aeronautics and engineering. Tochiro Oyama, a character in one of Matsumoto's later products, one with many visual similarities to his creator, may have been expressing the artist's earliest desires upon uttering this line.
This is a stupid war.
I guess we're both feeling frustrated.
If they'd only let me work without all this fighting, I could work on a great project with a future in it, like going to the moon.
Much was lost in Japan after World War II, including a great deal of the Matsumoto clan's wealth. They had not been without prior to the conflict. But afterwards, only one son could be afforded the opportunity to pursue higher education with the family's funds. Susumu, the younger brother, was decided to be the recipient, as Akira, Leiji Matsumoto's birth name, had already found work in manga. Beyond inspiration for the name of Space Battleship Yamato's primary shonen protagonist, Susumu became an accomplished space engineer in his own right, helping to consult Leiji on the realities, and potential subversions for said realities, that would come along with the fantastic spacecraft he designed. And fantastic spacecraft design was, ultimately, the most enduring contribution Leiji Matsumoto would make on the Space Battleship Yamato production. Original concepts for the ship encased it in rock, shooting across space like a comet. Right now, fans of the show may be making a connection to the asteroid encasing and ring the Yamato could manipulate in the final series. Obviously, these initial ideas would survive in some form, but Matsumoto understood not just the historical context of the reference, but the importance of portraying the centerpiece of the entire series in an iconic fashion. Remember those design documents he had been given? Everything was lining up. Will and destiny were working together in great harmony, which, funnily enough, is a rough translation of the word Yamato itself, as well as the ancient name for the island of Japan. Matsumoto was aware of the convergence and worked hard to present a narrative for how Japan could recover by reimagining the Bushido Code, core values of the now extinct samurai, through a lens that elevated human life as something worth protecting rather than an expendable asset whose only function is to preserve society's balance. But remember that nationalist anime producer Yoshinobu Nishizaki? The creative control offered to Leiji Matsumoto was not unlimited, and compromises were inevitable for both parties. These dramatically different points of view were fated to collide during production. Matsumoto, upon learning that Nishizaki wanted the shonen protagonist and his best friend to be paired in red and green respectively, asked the producer if he was colorblind. The standard in Japanese storytelling has always been to pair red, fire, with blue, water, demonstrating nature's balance through their interactions. Disagreements weren't simply limited to art direction, though, as the very lives of the Space Battleship Yamato's crew hung in the balance. Captain Juzo Okata would lead his crew further than any other human had ever gone before, but the physical toll of experiencing large amounts of radiation from planet bombs ordered by the opposition's leader Dessler left the aging officer in a degenerating state. Death stares Okata in his only visible eye as he struggles between Nishizaki's sacrificial patriotism and Matsumoto's desire for life more abundant. All of this human drama and effort finally culminated when Space Battleship Yamato Episode 1, SOS Earth, revived Space Battleship Yamato, broadcast via Yomiuri TV onto Japanese televisions across the island. But this grand launch was not the crowning spectacle the titans of animation had set out to create. In fact, it seemed like our hero's ship had struck an iceberg, and the name of that iceberg was Heidi, Girl of the Alps. Ratings for the series averaged between 2 and 2.5%, so the sponsors pulled out. Originally planned to run for 39 episodes, production was cut to 26. But why? Some theorized that Heidi, a highly popular time-slot competitor whose premise could be identified as family-friendly, won the popular vote in most households. While sons and fathers would later report to have shown initial interest in the space opera epic, they would go on to be outvoted for control of the remote by mothers and daughters. It's hard to blame them, given the series opens with a brutal depiction of a desperate and sacrificial space showdown that spend more time highlighting far-out and hypermasculine mechanical designs than the humans actually occupying them. Ironically, upon finding success years later, women would go on to form a considerable portion of the Yamato fanbase because of the compelling love stories Matsumoto refined for the plot. Leiji Matsumoto would later comment that the change suited him by that point. Between his work on the series, its manga, and the many other manga he was producing at the time, the load became all-consuming. While this work would help to ensure him a platform upon which he would build the rest of his career, it came at a cost. Mikun, the first cat Matsumoto ever personally owned, had contracted cancer at some point. By the time he noticed the problem, it was too late. Long hours at work had distracted him from the lives he loved most for too long. It's a common tragedy in Japan, and Matsumoto had caught it early. In memoriam, during the broadcast of Yamato's 10th episode, when Dr. Sato says goodbye to his own cat still on Earth, Matsumoto pointed his television speakers out the window toward the cat's grave and turned them up all the way. The veterinarian medicine available in 1970s Japan would most likely not have been able to cure Mikun, but it was the recognition of lost time with the feline friend that stuck out in his mind and moved him to never take on so much work at once ever again. But time also has a way of healing, if we let it. Just below the ocean floor that exists beneath mass public consciousness, the once-sunk Space Battleship Yamato began to stir. By the end of its original run, numbers took an upturn. Reruns caught on with larger audiences, who were given a second chance to take a year-long journey across the solar system. Older audiences were able to appreciate the more serious tone of the series, unafraid to deal with the horrors of war, Japan's greater position in the world, and how boys can become men through acts of bravery and integrity. The numbers made the next move a no-brainer: adapt the series into a full-length feature film. Even at the end of the series' production, directorial staff stuck around for another 5 days until March 30th to correct scenes in episode 22. Besides being broadcast in subpar quality, the staff had a concept to edit episodes 21 and 22 into its own short film to be shown independently in theaters in Tokyo. When it became clear that the series was a sleeper hit, it was decided to edit across all of the series and go feature length. After an editing effort starting in May of 1975 and a successful press effort across fan publications and magazines, a premiere date was set for August 6, 1977, across 7 theaters in Tokyo. An animation cell giveaway drew a large crowd the night before the premiere, and word of mouth from these screenings created a Yamato frenzy that would last for years. It should be noted that while Star Wars had premiered just a few months prior, Japanese audiences would still have to wait another year for it to arrive on their shores. This was a uniquely informed space opera movement. Yes, Matsumoto was heavily inspired by the European greats of literature and cinema, both classical and science fiction. But no one can deny that the Yamato and World War II themes of the show were informed by his particular insight regarding the greater context of narratives, both historic and fictitious. The show was a landmark for Japan's new major contribution to the world's popular culture, and a clear statement from a war-torn generation. We struggle to survive because life is worth preserving, even if that message would experience some shifting as it made its year-long journey across the Pacific to English-speaking audiences. Here's where you might think I'm going to talk about Star Blazers, but I'm not. Scene transition. Hollywood. A year after editing began, A production deal for the dub of Space Battleship Yamato, first translated as Space Cruiser Yamato, is met with producer Bernard Tabakin starting October of '76. In May of next year, it premiered at the prestigious Cannes Film Festival, a few months before it was actually shown in Japan. Reviews were unkind, labeling it a Star Wars ripoff despite predating it by several years. This misfire at Cannes did not stop a domestic release, and one more swing at the English audience was also allowed with the dub of the original series. This time, it was a home run. Star Blazers was part of the initial wave of anime to reach American audiences in 1979, which was started by Osamu Tezuka's Astro Boy in '61. The 2 decades prior saw stories like Gigantor, originally Techijin 28, Jungle Emperor Leo, and, of course, Speed Racer, broadcast nationally. These series focused on individual stories rather than grand episodic narratives. American children were far more accustomed to the likes of Scooby-Doo and its various clones, which featured a gang dealing with Monster of the Week narratives. Star Blazers was something different, though, providing a continuous story that contained an ominous one-year countdown that added a growing pressure to the crew's scenarios. Some awkward changes exist in this localization as well, turning sake into spring water and the space cruiser Yamato into the Argo, a reference to the inspirational journey of the ship ridden by Jason and the Argonauts. Perhaps well enough, the localizers also decided not to expose young American children, the intended audience for nearly all animation at the time despite the older skew that appreciated it in Japan, to deadly violence or Yukimori's panties. This really just scratches the surface. My goal here was to present an overview of Space Battleship Yamato's production story. If you're curious about my thoughts on the actual storytelling of Yamato, I suggest, beyond watching it for yourself by whatever means necessary, heading over to our episode of the Free Arcadia podcast on the first movement of Yamato, including the original series, movie, and the reboot series 2199, featuring Mercury Falcon, where I got him to admit he enjoyed the reboot's 3D animation. Taboo. Shocking. Space Battleship Yamato is an icon, a symbol that calls to the youth and asks them to carry the future without sacrificing it all. The middle path that calls to all conscious life, which leads to individual and collective prosperity through hardship. Sometimes, I worry if that's what's being lost in modern anime. Not to yell at a cloud, but to me, that message gets lost through interpretive pieces like Gundam and Neon Genesis Evangelion. Oh, speaking of Hideaki Anno, he's actually producing a special project, assumedly animation, for the 50th anniversary of Yamato. So let's stay hyped for that regardless of my old Taku takes here. Is anime starting to go too far the other way? Has the pendulum swung so far culturally in Japan that now the pursuit of identity, especially for young men, is so laden with self-aware neuroses that it can't see the beauty of life that makes itself known if we allow it? I hope not, but if it is, there will always be a symbol approaching from the non-existent horizon of space to guide us farther than we've ever gone to attain what will restore our shared humanity. Thanks everybody so much for watching this Yamato 50-year anniversary retrospective. Like, comment, share, subscribe. Leijiverse is the world's largest Leiji Matsumoto fan project, so let's keep that up. Happy birthday, Yamato.